Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to English as a Lingua Nordica and English of Our Own. This is a seminar jointly hosted by NEET, Nordic Editors and Translators, and Nordic Culture Point. My name is Eochagáin, and I'm the chairman of the board of NEET. NEET was founded in 2014 with the aim of bringing together editors and translators in Finland and the other Nordic countries, and in the past 7 years, we've hosted many events with a focus on professionalization and education. And one of the things we've traditionally done every spring, usually in March or April, is an event with a strong reliance on research, which highlights the various professional strengths, not only that our members have, but that our members are interested in. And I'm very happy that we are continuing that tradition today with English as a Lingua Nordica. A couple of words about NEET. We now have over 100 members in most of the Nordic countries and beyond, and I believe we've people joining us from some very far-flung places today, so welcome to all of you. A word about our co-host. Nordic Culture Point is an institution of the Nordic Council of Ministers, which works to support Nordic cooperation within the area of culture and to increase awareness of Nordic culture in Finland and in the Nordic region. And I'd like to thank our cooperation partners at Nordic Culture Point for all of the work they've done in helping us put this great event together today. We have 3 speakers today, and they will be speaking for approximately 20 or 30 minutes each, and then there will be questions and answers afterwards. As the speakers are speaking, please submit your questions to them in the Facebook Live event. And then a moderator of ours will be reading those questions and proposing them to the speakers. Afterwards, at around 6 o'clock, there will be a social event for discussion about the day's seminar and anything else you want to talk about at 6 o'clock on Zoom. And NEET members would have received that link by email. But it's also available if you go to the NEET website, nordicedit.fi, and click on events, and there will be a page about this event, and you can find the link there. But please do not click on it until 6 o'clock, because nothing is going to happen there until 6 o'clock. For now, this is the event that we're in. That is, I think, all of the housekeeping I have for the moment. So I'm going to hand over to Judi Rose, who is going to introduce our first speaker. Judi.
Yes, hello. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Peterson, and she holds a position as associate professor in the Department of Languages at University of Helsinki. In 2019, she was awarded the title of docent. And her research areas are language contact with English and heritage Scandinavian languages in Utah, USA. And without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. How is the volume? Great, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I grew up in the United States of America, where there is a very, very long-term television game show called The Price is Right. And with the name of my talk, and also the way the text appears on the screen in front of you, I'm kind of riffing on that game show on every morning at 9 a.m. Before I go any further, I want to make it clear that I do not believe that anyone listening to my talk today is in fact a bad person, and I don't want to imply otherwise with the subtitle on this slide here. Rather, in my research and teaching, I'm answering a call to incorporate and address the need for a sociolinguistics perspective on how we use and teach English around the world today. By sociolinguistics perspective, what I mean is that we shouldn't exclude the social and cultural properties of the language. We should not see English as something out of its context. I also want to make it clear that in my talk I use the terms language and English, but in fact, as a linguist, one who works on spoken language, I am in fact mostly referring to spoken English. And I'll be very interested to know if the comments that I have to make today about spoken English seem to apply to the professional editors, translators, writers, and so on who are listening. Do these properties in fact apply to written English as well? Something interesting has happened in the last few decades with regard to the use of English. In fact, I think we could well argue that many interesting things have happened. But what I'm referring to in particular is one specific phenomenon. I'll ask a question. You don't need to answer it out loud, of course, just answer it to yourself. When I say an English-speaking country, what comes to mind? Chances are that many of you automatically think of places where English is in fact a majority language, spoken in many, many domains, maybe even all domains, by most of the people who live in that place. So it's a widespread mother tongue. So perhaps you thought of places like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But please, take a look at this map that I'm showing on the screen right now. This map shows the results of English proficiency tests administered by a for-profit educational company. It's important to note that it is a for-profit educational company called EF English Proficiency Index. The results that you see on this map are based on a measurement provided by this company based on a free online exam which has been finished by individuals who are interested in knowing what their level of English is. How proficient are they? This is considered a survey and not a controlled research project because it's definitely biased. It's biased towards younger people who have access to the internet and who tend to be the main internet users. We know this from just basic demographics. Since the survey was first made available in 2012, 1.7 million individuals have completed the exam. And you see the results here. What I would like you to notice is that there are in fact a few countries in Northern Europe, namely the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, which rank as being highly proficient in English as, quote-unquote, English-speaking countries. Not that far distant, in fact, from the areas that you see here in purple, the United States, Canada, the UK, and so on. Let's look at a different version, a similar type of survey. Here we are narrowing down our viewpoint to just the EU. So that's, for example, why Norway is not highlighted on the map here. This is a slightly different kind of survey. This is from data that was this survey was administered by something called Eurobarometer in the year 2006, asking EU citizens to answer the following question: are you able to have a conversation in English? So this is based on what people think about the way they speak English. If you were to compare the previous slide with this one, you would see that the percentages here have gone slightly up. So including in the Nordic, that the earlier slide was a few percentage points down, especially true for Sweden, which, well, probably doesn't surprise anybody who has lived in the Nordic for very long. Sorry, that was just a joke. Okay, but with these images, I want to demonstrate that, well, no surprise. We happen to have a very high level of proficiency in English in Finland. This is very well demonstrated through these maps and through walking through the streets in Finland, for example. And not so far distant, according to these surveys here, from so-called native-speaking environments like the UK and the US when it comes to actual people who have proficiency. I've lived in Finland for many, many years now, and I want to tell you that I am never going to stand in front of you and tell you how bad the English is here. In fact, I get a little tired of being asked to comment on how bad the English is here, because it's not. In many ways, in fact, as the level of proficiency in English has gone up and up and up, it's as if the bar is raised ever higher. The the carrot is dangled higher and higher and higher. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, it would have been enough to just be able to have a conversation. It's not enough anymore. Now it seems like it's only enough if one sounds native-like, whatever that means. I'd like to remind you that we're talking about a language with 1.5 billion speakers, by the latest estimates, that resides and lives in many, many different homes around the world, many different territories around the world. So what exactly does it mean to be a native speaker? What exactly is the target that we're looking for? I think many people might have an idea about what that means. Let's explore that a little bit further. A few years ago, 2015, a story appeared in the Finnish tabloid called Ilta-Sanomat, and I translated the title into English. Here's the English version. It says, "Expert on party leaders' English skills. Did not understand all of Soini's speeches." Well, I happen to know the so-called expert they consulted. That's because it was me. It was a terrible task to be asked to do for a descriptive linguist. And I thought it was actually quite mean-spirited to be asked to sit there and listen to the party leaders from that time, 2015, Soini, Stubb, and others, and to be asked to openly criticize the way they speak in English. I had to think long and hard, do I really want to do this task? But in the end, I decided to do it because I thought they would just ask the next person, and the next person probably really would be mean-spirited. So what happened in this exact setting, I can perhaps explain a little bit, is that I was asked to listen to various recordings from each of the party leaders and just to comment on what I was hearing. So I was saying things like, oh, this is perfectly comprehensible, and you can hear this and you can hear that. But when it got to Soini, it wasn't so much that I didn't understand his pronunciation or anything about his English. It was that I literally didn't know what the words meant. He used some kind of a specific term that I didn't know what it meant. It was certainly English, but it wasn't a term that I was personally familiar with. So I stopped and said, oh, I didn't understand that. And then here you go. This is how it gets interpreted. Let's compare this headline with the next one. Aha. Here's a more recent headline. Any number of examples would do. I've just chosen 2 of them. You can see that this article appeared in Helsinki Sanomat in January 2020. This is a story about the then minister, she's no longer a minister, Katri Kulmuni. And here is the translation in English of the main headline and the subheadline from Helsinki Sanomat. It says, Katri Kulmuni's delightful British English dropped jaws on social media. We asked linguists if she would be an upper or lower class Brit. And then further, Twitter delights over Katri Kulmuni's British English. Linguists say Kulmuni's language skills are on par with native speakers, and such a high level among Finns is only an advantage. Turns out in the article that she claims that she learned her English from watching the television series Emmerdale, which is a bit confusing because they don't really speak high-class English on Emmerdale, but there's a lot of holes in this story that need to be filled in. That's just one of many. There are so many things that we could unpack just from this headline and the subhead. But I would like to ask you just one question that we will return to later. How would this headline have been perceived if, in fact, it had said, Katri Kulmunen's delightful Finnish dropped jaws? Is she an upper class or a lower class Finn? I have a couple of points I'd like to make now. Thinking back on my initial statement that it's important to have a sociolinguistic perspective to any language, especially a language so widely taught and used as English. I think most of us would agree without hesitation that a language and its culture cannot and should not be separated. Think of Finland and Finnish and Finland Swedish. Think of Sweden and Swedish. Think of Norway and Norwegian, and on and on and on. Why are we so willing to divorce English from its cultural and social underpinnings compared to these other languages? I think no one here would argue that these elements are not inextricably linked. And yet with English, as it zooms around the world and is used by so many people, we happily, quite eagerly in fact, seem to overlook a couple of key points. First of all, let's remember the reason for the spread of English, which in yet another map, yes, I have a lot of maps, which is indicated with the map that you see here, which shows the spread of English due to colonialism. To ignore this basic fact is to have an anachronistic and reductionist view of the English language. We've already established a language is never just a language. It's a language plus all of the history, all of the baggage of that language, the good, the bad, the ugly, as well as the beautiful and the appealing. Let's keep in mind then that English first spread throughout the world because of colonization. The English were very, very good colonizers. We all know this. After the colonial period, we have a different but very closely related phenomenon, and that's the spread of English as a concerted effort towards the further globalization through the use of English. As linguists such as David Crystal have pointed out in many of his books, for example, English was already there due to its strong colonial presence. But then in the current era, this century, the previous century I should say, we see it expanding into new territories that were not colonized, places like Finland and the Nordic countries. It's interesting to note that in the context of Finland, we witness a different kind of narrative. I've lived here for a long time. I'm a professional linguist. I know the narrative well. This kind of narrative about English being introduced as a major foreign language, with Finland as an active agent as part of the modernization of Finland, the post-World War II push for modernization, for Western ties, for economic improvement and so on, a concerted effort to make English part of those efforts. This is no doubt true, all of this. But two things can be true at the same time. And another part of this truth is that with these up-and-coming superpowers in this new world order that emerged after World War II, there was also a concerted push on the part of the United States as an emerging superpower through efforts like the State Department in teaching English, as well as Britain through efforts such as the British Council. Now, this quotation that's shown in front of you here is from as early as 1935. Here we have a quote from who was then the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII. If you're wondering, yes, this was the king who abdicated who wrote this. And in his inauguration for the British Council, he wrote and said also, "The basis of our work must be the English language, and we are aiming at something more profound than just a smattering of our tongue. Our object is to assist the largest number possible to appreciate fully the glories of our literature, our contribution to the arts and sciences, and our preeminent contribution to political practice. This can be best achieved by promoting the study of our language abroad." It does not get more explicit than this, what the efforts were here. So, in addition to the narrative of Finland as an active agent in bringing English in to assist with its new kind of order on the world stage, I suggest that Finland was also in an object position. That is, that in addition to being a player, it was also played. This is kind of the perfect storm, how English comes here and other places in the world as well. So taking this in for a moment, this information, and the main question that comes up then is, so what? So what if English is a language that carries with it a tradition of colonialism and elitism, class-based systems, and even human exploitation? So what? These things simply don't apply in Finland. Here, English is something different. It's a communication tool. To this, I would like to remind you that if our use of English here in Finland is just English, then why is a major newspaper like Helsingin Sanomat running a headline that, like the one I showed you previously? Is this upper class or lower class British English? If we in Finland are so separate from the cultural history of English, why was this a relevant news story? And again, this is one of many examples. Why would this even be a relevant question if, in fact, we hadn't taken in the cultural baggage as well here? Congratulations, Finland. For the 4th year in a row, Finland has been measured as the happiest country in the world based on the areas of gross domestic product, social support, health and life expectancy, freedom, generosity, and levels of corruption. From a sociological point of view, we know that there is no such thing as any society that does not have some kind of social class distinctions. Yet, having moved to Finland as an immigrant, I very quickly learned that there is an ideology that runs deep, deep, deep in the Finnish psyche. And that is, everyone here is equal. Everyone here has the same opportunities. We all have the same value in society. We are all a piece of the pie, and it's a very good pie. My question then is, why are we so eager to take on the inequality related to language and social privilege when it comes to English? How is it that the ideologies about a language that has this history of English, the story of English, which is so very, very different from the history and story of a language like Finnish, why have we taken in ideologies here that in fact are so foreign? Should be anyway, considering these deeply entrenched ideologies in the psyche here. It's a question that really bothers me, actually. I hope that somebody can enlighten me. I'm going to wrap up soon, but first I wanted to share this kind of conundrum as well. There's a concept that many people outside of the field of linguistics seem to have a hard time maybe accepting or acknowledging, despite the fact that we have decades and decades of research and work that verified this kind of relationship that I'm demonstrating here on this slide. And that is that there is bountiful evidence of social injustice and discrimination based on the use of language. With this slide, I'm drawing on my school days from math, where we learned about inductive reasoning. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Many people will readily admit that we have social injustices based on ethnicity, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, age, etc., etc., etc. These are things that most people have no problem agreeing about. At the same time, most people are quite willing to accept as truth that the way we speak is an intrinsic part of our identity, that just like ethnicity, race, gender, age, and so on, our use of language is not even just a mirror of those things, but it is inherently tied in together into one package that forms our identity. The way you speak tells so much about where you came from, your level of education, the social groups that you align with, and so on, and so on, and so on. Why then are everyday people outside of the field of linguistics, maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but why are people so reluctant to admit and acknowledge that there is discrimination involved with language, and that in fact we, as language professionals, perpetuate that kind of discrimination? It's quite frustrating, actually, as a linguist, to note that we have reams and reams of books and articles about just this topic, but that our understanding of language-based discrimination doesn't seem to have reached a broader audience. It remains something that the population at large simply doesn't seem to be tuned into. We need to do better work in this area. Returning to the question then, the initial question. What is the price of being right about English? Well, I can think of a couple of things. Maybe you get to gloat a little if you know how to use apostrophes according to style. Oh, and semicolons. Don't even get me started on semicolons. But the price we pay if we unquestioningly perpetuate the divide between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to language is, in essence, another form of elitism. I propose that we can continue to do our work as editors, writers, translators, educators, and so on, but without forgetting that we are working in an extremely privileged environment, and to not forget or overlook what has brought the English language to this point. Thank you.
Yes, let's see if our audience has any questions here. Okay.
The suspense is killing me.
Yes, so far it doesn't seem to.
Maybe there's too much to take
Two
in.
questions. Okay, I missed them somewhere. I can't. I can't access that. I'm on the Nordic Culture Point. Okay, but it won't let me access the video. And it's I only see the.
I can pass on one question here from
Okay,
Nordic Culture
thank you.
Point.
Sure.
It says, do these inequalities, parentheses, classicism, etc., of English show up in language testing here?
Yes. So I don't know if everybody could hear the question, but it was about, do these inequalities show up in language testing? And we have all kinds of research that shows that standardized tests in general, not just with language, are very class biased. And I'm sorry to break the news that certainly applies to language tests as well. That we have, and it's a real dilemma. You have to test on something. I get it. I talk about this with my students at the university all the time. Most of them go on to become English teachers. So when we are forced, in a way, through our profession to uphold standards, to be gatekeepers, what do we test on when we have a language with endless variation and, as I said before, 1.5 billion speakers? And the fact of the matter is that those tests do favor certain kinds of speakers. So, for example, we have lots of research in the United States that shows that children who grow up in what we call a standard language environment, a home environment where standardized English is used, they have a great advantage when they go to school and start learning to read and write, because the way they speak maps on so much easier, let's say, to the way written language is represented in the textbooks and so on. And that just carries on through the whole system. So, yeah. My short answer is yes, it certainly does. Any more questions? You can't see anything,
No,
can you?
no, it won't let me. Okay, yeah.
What to do about that dilemma is another question. And oh, that's such a complicated answer. Certainly testers have been aware of this for a long time, but what do we do when we have to keep doing the standardized test? It's really a complicated area.
Yeah. Ian, do you want to ask the question and I'll ask it? Doesn't seem Elizabeth can hear you.
Okay. Well, the question was, how does Finland compare with the other Nordic countries in terms of cultural imperialism / colonization? Is there a difference? We think being the victim, quote unquote, here is an advantage.
Yeah, that's a
Okay,
really
yeah.
interesting point. And in fact, we've got some wonderful research from, what's her name? Suvi Keskinen, for example, just one name here at the University of Helsinki, who has recently written some wonderful articles and done edited books about that, where I'm sorry to say that maybe Finland hasn't always been in the role of victim. For example, Sweden was definitely a colonizer, and well, Finland was part of Sweden, and we have the people who would have been part of that movement to go to places in the Americas, the missions in South America, and so on. So there again is quite complicated. Interesting question. So maybe not such an active role as places like Denmark and Sweden, but maybe not as 100% innocent as people would like to think. And going between the role of victim and conquestor is always a bit tricky anyway. There's always shades of gray.
Yeah, I have a question about, you mentioned the textbooks in the United States. Do they, I'm sure they've changed. I mean, I've lived in Finland for 30 years, and I'm sure the textbooks have changed since then. But I remember them being very, let's say, geared towards the standardized, or let's say people from who speak the standardized English at home, right? If you want to, say the white population, then so be it.
Yeah,
How is that? Has that changed any?
I think it has. Yeah, we know so much more about other forms of English in the United States. And I particularly have followed the developments with African American English. It's such a well-researched part of American English, just wonderful, beautiful research on that variety of American English. And but what we found out there applies to obviously other language groups as well. And there have been really measured and concerted efforts to help the students who come from homes where, let's say, African American English in its vernacular form is spoken and used, to sort of make that bridge then to the standardized form that they can then participate more fully in the classroom environment by looking at these textbooks, which obviously are published in standardized English and so on. So educators are becoming increasingly aware. I absolutely take my hat off to these educators who have so much to deal with already. But how wonderful that they're trying to take into account the different and various language needs of all of their students.
Yeah.
because it is such an important cultural property. And of course, to denigrate a student's home language has a deeply profound injuring effect on the student, alienates the student from the get-go. We don't want that.
Definitely. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So, any other questions or comments, Ian, on the? Okay.
But I'm not sure if Elizabeth can hear me now, but I get the
I
impression
can
she
hear you,
can.
Ian. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that. Well, so my question was, what do you think about the other type of narrative? I agree with your point of English being a language of elitism, but then my impression as a non-American is that in America you have a very strong idea of English being a ticket to a better life, particularly for immigrants, and it being a great equalizer. And obviously, I mean, it's a lot of holes in that sort of idea, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think you just said what I think about that, Ian, and that is that, I mean, I was talking about this metaphor of the carrot being dangled higher, and so it becomes, this question of language, and it's never just the language, is it? It's everything else. It's racism, it's xenophobia, it's all these things, and then you make, the use of English, this sort of golden ticket then you'll get in, but it doesn't happen that way, does it? So it seems like this fake bill of goods. Yeah. Of course, it doesn't hurt, I suppose, but yeah, it's not a golden ticket. We have much bigger issues that are wrapped up in this kind of gilded question of language. Really good point.
Okay, well, thank you, Elizabeth, very much. This is really interesting.
Been a pleasure. We can take questions later if they come up.
Okay, yeah, great.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye.
Yep, bye-bye. Okay, our next speaker is Pauliina Peltonen from the University of Turku. And Pauliina is a project researcher in the Department of English, and she is an applied linguist whose main field of study is second language learning and L2 speech fluency. She is also interested in L2 interaction and multimodality. Pauliina has co-edited the volume Fluency in L2 Learning and Use with Pekka Lintunen and Maarit Mutta, and her work can also be found in journals such as the Modern Language Journal System, European Journal of Applied Linguistics. She is a member of the Fluency Research Group FlowLang and Leala, the Center for Language Learning and Research at the University of Turku. So, Pauliina, I will say at this point that the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Judi, for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be able to join the event from sunny Turku. And my talk will be about our project MultiFluency that has to do with second language speech fluency across 3 different languages. And we can take a look at the background slide, actually, first to contextualize this topic a little bit. So speech fluency is a key construct in second language learning, teaching, and assessment. And here I refer to second language fluency, but it doesn't necessarily refer chronologically to the second language, but it can mean any additional language learned after the first one. And actually, this nicely links with the previous talk and some of the issues raised there and questions about how speaking a language ties in with your identity and reflects your identity. Here we take a look at some of these similar things from a learner perspective. So if we think about speech fluency research, a lot of it has focused on comparing learner speech against the native norm. So for instance, L2 English with L1 English speakers. But what we then know less about is how our own speaking style in the first language affects speech fluency in the second one. So it hasn't been as common to compare speakers' speech samples in different languages. So that is what we are doing in this project. Instead of having an external norm, in a sense, we take speech samples from the same speakers in different languages. So this also relates to the theme of multi-fluency then. And if we think about Finland as a context for these types of multilingual studies, already Håkan Ringbom has in his research looked at L2 English produced by L1 Finnish speakers and L1 Swedish speakers. So compared these two learner groups and looked at their English, because it's quite interesting to compare these two groups, as there are so similar cultural, educational backgrounds, but then the first language is typologically different. So it's interesting to see how that influences their L2 English production. The main idea has been that the Swedish speakers initially, at least, get an advantage due to this typological closeness, and their general bilingualism often. But then as a high enough proficiency level is reached in English, these two groups come closer to each other. So there aren't that big of a difference. There isn't that big of a difference anymore in their English production. So this is also something we can then look at in this project. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see the full title of the project there. So MultiFluency is short for fluency across multilingual speakers. And as I already said, the focus here is on looking at speech fluency in different languages. And in the case of this project, the focus is on three languages. So we look at Finnish, Swedish, and English. And we do have two groups. So we have Finnish speakers. So we have their Finnish speech samples, then L2 Swedish and L2 English samples. And then we have a group of Swedish speakers, or actually bilingual Finnish Swedish speakers, most of them, their Finnish and Swedish speech samples, and then also their L2 English. So this is a rich data set for exploring these different languages among these speakers. And actually, the main aspects we are interested in are in the forms of questions. Following slide. So we look at cross-linguistic differences and their influence. We're especially interested in, as I said, these differences between the Finnish speakers and Swedish speakers in their L2 English. But then we also look at this influence of individual speaking style in the native language, and then how that influences speech fluency in a second language. So this means what I explained before, that we take from the same speakers their first language productions and then compare productions in other languages to that first language production. And if we move on then to the slide that presents our team, we're a small but efficient team. So Our principal investigator is Pekka Lintunen. I'm the project researcher in the group, and then we have been lucky to have 2 research assistants who have helped us with the data coding, transcription, and so on. And the funding has been provided by the Swedish Cultural Foundation in Finland. What I'm going to talk about today are the preliminary results of the first phase, but then we are lucky to be able to continue with the forthcoming second phase. If there's time, I can talk a little bit about that.
Excuse me, Pauliina, can you see the slides?
Yeah, we are actually already, you can move on one more. Yes, so now you can switch to the second one that has the website on it. So yes, now the slides have caught up. So I want to mention before going into the details of this project that this is a part of a larger research group operating at the School of Languages and Translation Studies at the University of Turku, where we have, for instance, another fluency-related project going on actually at the same time. So we have this FlowLang research group that Judi already mentioned. So you can follow the progress of these projects when you go to utu.fi/flowlang. That's fairly easy to remember. So we will post some of the publications and information about these projects there. So it's a useful website to follow the progress of these. But then if we move on to the details of this MultiFluency project and start by addressing what is speech fluency then. So in common language use, we can often say something like that we are fluent in Spanish or not as fluent in German. But if we take fluency as a more specialized term, it then often refers to a narrower component of oral proficiency, not the whole proficiency in a particular language, but a small part of it that can, for instance, be distinguished from accuracy and complexity that are often also studied along with fluency. So speech fluency essentially refers to the effortlessness and naturalness of speech, and that is often then examined in practice by measuring different temporal aspects from speech. So we look at things like speech rates, so how fast we talk, and then how often do we pause, where do we pause. More proficient speakers usually concentrate their pauses on clause boundaries rather than mid-clause locations and so on. So this is something that we can analyze. Then we can also look at how it's possible to maintain fluency if you happen to forget a word or just aren't temporarily able to retrieve it. So you could use resources like repetitions, filled pauses, features like these to buy some time and think about what to say next. So that is another aspect of fluency that we can analyze. So that's fluency in a nutshell. Then if we move on to looking at the data for this project. So today I will be talking about the first two groups. I mentioned that we look at Swedish-speaking university students. I probably didn't say that they were university students, but our participants happen to be university level students. So that is the other group, and then we have Finnish-speaking university students. And from both of these groups, we have speech samples in 3 different languages that we can then compare. There is a group of Swedish-speaking university students in Sweden as well, but this is a relatively small group, so we haven't compared the data from the other groups with this group yet. So we'll just focus on the first 2 groups for now and their fluency in these 3 languages. If we then look at the data collection and so the following slide where we have the different comic strips, yes. So the process is basically collecting the speech data, then transcribing it in written format for analysis, and then annotation for different fluency features. And due to this pandemic, we had to rethink our data collection a little bit. There was actually some on-site teaching going on at the university last autumn, so we collected the main data set in a language lab, but then we had to come up with hybrid and remote solutions. So we then recorded some participants individually and then some over Zoom so that we could control these comic strips that were shown to them during the data collection. So essentially we had a background questionnaire, and then the main data set are these short speech samples based on the 3 comics that you can see there. The prompt was just to tell a story. In the case of this project, the content actually doesn't matter as much to us, but we are interested in these small details of the speech samples, such as the pauses and the flow, general flow of speech. On the next slide, then we can just take a quick look at the numbers that we have been able to put together, or the data set that we have been able to collect during this time. So we have 49 participants at the moment. Probably at least one more is coming, hopefully later this week. So the collection is still ongoing, but we have some preliminary analysis made based on this data set already. And on the next slide, I actually wanted to take the time here also to thank the contacts for data collections at these universities, because as we had to change our plans and to come up with all kinds of different solutions, the participant recruitment was also a bit challenging. So here the contacts were really helpful, and we couldn't have done it without them. And also our advisory board has been really helpful throughout this whole process and the funding application part before the project even got started as well. Then if we move on to the next slide, just to recap our aim here. So we wanted to look at multilingual speakers' fluency across these 3 languages. And we actually had two main points here that we wanted to focus on. So we looked at differences in fluency between these 2 groups. And then we examined, for both groups, we examined the connections between these different language productions. So that then provided us with some information of how these different language productions are connected for the individual speakers. We can go over the next slide fairly quickly. I will just quickly comment on these fluency measures that we used. I already talked about these a little bit. So we looked at these temporal fluency measures having to do with how fast you speak, which also relates to how often you pause as well. And then we looked at these different small words and different resources that can be used to maintain the flow of speech. So we don't have to go into that much more detail about the measures. But rather, let's take a look at the preliminary results. So starting with the differences between the two groups, Finnish speakers and the Swedish speakers. We actually don't see a lot of differences in their Finnish fluency based on these measures. And as I said, even though we call these Finnish-speaking group and Swedish-speaking group, many of the Swedish speakers reported being Swedish-Finnish bilinguals. They came from the Turku area, so that was in a way to be expected. And actually, there weren't really many differences in their English productions from a fluency perspective. So this relates to what I said at the beginning, that even though the Swedish speakers might have an initial advantage in learning English, these were now already university students. So by this time, it seems that these two groups had reached a fairly similar level of fluency. We didn't look at other aspects of their proficiency at this point, just focused on this speech fluency part. But this is something we have seen also in some of our previous studies, that by university level, it seems that there aren't that big differences anymore between these two groups in L2 English fluency. Then perhaps the other point here, this is probably not that surprising, but the Swedish speakers who had Swedish as their first language performed better in Swedish than the Finnish speaking group who had studied Swedish as a second language, and actually some of them hadn't really used Swedish after upper secondary school. So this was in a way to be expected. Then if we move on to looking at the connections between the different language productions, and starting with the Swedish speaking group. Here I would say that the results were kind of what we expected or assumed that they might be. So here we saw that the correlations in fluency were strongest for the Swedish and Finnish productions for both of these aspects of fluency. So basically, for many of these, the connections between their two first languages were the strongest. But we also saw moderate to strong correlations between their L1 productions and English. So both Finnish and English, and then Swedish and English. So here we can say that the L1 fluency patterns seem to be, at least to some extent, visible in L2 English. For the Finnish speakers, then the picture is then a little bit different if we take a look at the next slide. So here the correlations were stronger between Finnish and L2 English than between L1 Finnish and L2 Swedish. And this is in a way in line with the when we looked at the differences as well. So this can be explained by the fact that their proficiency level was higher in English than in Swedish. So that's why it's closer to the L1 Finnish fluency profile. But what was sort of a sidetrack here that we also wanted to look at when we had the opportunity and had the data that we really haven't had the opportunity to look at this before, was to compare two L2 productions from this Finnish-speaking group. So we looked at the correlations between Swedish and English. And here actually some of the stalling mechanisms correlated quite strongly. So this is then quite interesting and could mean that there are some individual ways of how these speakers maintain fluency across these L2s, but they are not necessarily related to the mechanisms that they use in their L1. So these might be some learned resources, for instance. But we have to examine this a bit more closely and maybe do some complementary qualitative analysis to see what the connections are then like. So on the following slide, just to recap so far the main preliminary findings. When comparing the Finnish-speaking and Swedish-speaking groups, we saw the clearest differences in fluency for Swedish, not so much for Finnish or for English. So this is already the next slide, if you can change. Yes, thank you. Then if we look at the correlations there for the Swedish-speaking group, strongest correlations between the two L1s, and for the Finnish speakers then between Finnish and English. So this confirms some of the previous findings that have shown that there are some connections between how you speak in your first language, how you tend to pause, and how fast you tend to speak. That is connected to your L2 fluency, but based on this study and other ones as well, we have to take into account the participants' L1 and of course the proficiency level as well. And it tends to go so that the higher the proficiency level is in the L2, the more strongly it correlates with the L1 productions. You come closer to the L1 production. And we were able to see here some correlations between the L1s for the bilingual Swedish speaking group, and then interestingly also between the two L2 productions for the L2 Swedish and L2 English when we looked at the Finnish speakers. And there are a couple more slides, but the actual final one is the next one that has the implications, then the so what, and thinking about what this then could mean in practice and how should this be taken into account, and also links to the questions of testing that were asked at the end of the previous talk. So I wouldn't make any very strong recommendations based on this. The whole language testing is such a complex endeavor, but what we could say based on these results is that acknowledging the fact that how you speak in your first language is bound to show up in one way or another in your L2 speech fluency is something to acknowledge, for instance, in L2 teaching, assessment, And these different ways of avoiding long silences and maintaining fluency could also be taken up in teaching, practiced, depending, of course, on the learner's level. Different types of speech comparisons could be made, speech recorded in different languages and compared and then analyzed. So this sort of awareness raising is at least something that can be suggested based on these results. And the other point relates to this variation across speakers. So especially with these different stalling mechanisms and resources for how you tend to fill your silences, there's a lot of variation in that, even among the L1 samples, if we look at those, also in L2 as well. But this is an important point to bear in mind. And also these different fluency profiles, that's linked to this same idea that even among native speakers, there are slow speakers, fast speakers, and we can then compare that to other languages and L2s. But it's something to bear in mind that there is this variation even in L1 speech. Okay, then the last two slides were just some links to the project, information about some texts we have written in Finnish and Swedish about the project if you want to read more. Then there were the references after that, and the final slide that you could put up there if that's possible just had thank yous in all three project languages. So thank you, tack, kiitos, thank you for your attention. I'm not sure about the time. I now see Judi coming in, so if there are some questions, maybe we have time for those.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. The first one is from Christian Evans, who wrote 101 English Mistakes Finns Do, a dictionary of mistakes. And he's asking, what do you think about accuracy being communicative? So meaning that being understood to an acceptable level, Finns especially like to focus on accuracy.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's probably something that has at least been true in the past. If we think about language teaching in the 50s, 60s, before this more communicative approach, many people have experiences of not being brave enough to speak in the language just because they are afraid of making mistakes. And I certainly hope that that is no longer the case, and I imagine that the teaching approach is so much more focused on the just being understandable and being able to communicate meanings, that since that is now much more the focus, that would also make people more willing to speak in English and other foreign languages that they are learning, so that they wouldn't worry about small mistakes so much, but would be brave enough to communicate in whatever the language is that they are learning.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then one more. A couple more. Virve Juhola is asking, So who are more fluent so who are more fluent English speakers, Finnish speakers or Swedish speakers? In general, in your opinion, to generalize a bit.
Well, in this context, with the university students, we didn't really see a difference. But if I think back to one study where we had upper secondary school students, so a slightly lower proficiency level, there we actually did see a difference in fluency between these two language groups. So there, Håkan Ringbom's hypothesis was confirmed that the upper secondary school students that spoke Swedish as their first language were a little bit more fluent than the Finnish speakers. So it goes hand in hand what Ringbom has suggested, that at the beginning stages and perhaps intermediate as well, that's where we might see these differences, and that's where the Swedish speakers might have some advantage over the Finnish speakers due to the typological closeness, and just since many are bilingual, that might also give them a head start in a way. But at a high enough proficiency level, then we don't really, at least for fluency, see these differences so clearly anymore.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank you. And then Kate Soriev Wilson is asking, what sort of cross-linguistic resources to help encourage fluency across languages could we envisage?
Well, that would perhaps be something that we more concretely will look at in the next phase, if we take a closer look at these speech samples and identify these different resources in a more qualitative way. Here the approach has been very quantitative. But one early study, actually from the 70s already, by Lehtonen comes to mind, who did these similar comparisons and found that then the Swedish-speaking participants there were actually a bit more skilled compared to the Finnish speakers in filling their silences with all these little filled pauses or filler words. But that's really something that we haven't yet looked at in detail, considering these different resources, whether the same thing happens here. But somehow, I guess that comes to the awareness raising aspect as well, that being aware of these different ways of maintaining the flow of speech, that's something that perhaps the Swedish speakers then had, at least in that Lehtonen study at that time, they were more skilled in maintaining this flow. But actually, in the next phase, we will also look at the perceived fluency aspect. So we will have some fluency assessments as well, listeners listening to these samples, and then we might be able to get some insight into these resources and what these samples sound like to listeners and from their perspective.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, it really sounds interesting. This is quite a project. I mean, it's really involved, and you have a lot going on here, I can see. And so I am assuming there's going to be a continuation to this project.
Yes. So that's then gonna involve these assessment aspects. So far we have just been putting our headphones on and listening to the samples in our little researcher chambers, but then we will take this radar aspect as well and see what they sound like to for instance, teachers of these languages.
Okay, wonderful. All right, sounds good. Really interesting, and I wish we could talk more, but I think we have to let the next speaker come in. And, so thank you very much, Pauliina. And yes, so our next speaker is will be presented by Henrik from the Nordic Culture Point. And Henrik, are you there?
I'm here. Oh, the other way. So, yeah, on behalf of Nordic Culture Point, we would like to thank the speakers so far, and also the cooperation with NEET, which has been very fruitful. And we're happy for all of you who have chosen to join the seminar today for this interesting topic. Scandinavian languages has always been in the foundation of Nordic cooperation. I myself, I'm Norwegian, and I can speak Norwegian here at my work. At the same time, the influence of English is ever increasing, so it makes us here curious to see how these two languages can find coexistence in a fruitful way in the Nordic region. The position of English in the Nordic cooperation is something we rarely discuss, at least here in this house, and therefore we're happy to let the cat out of the bag and bring the topic to the table. I hope these English idioms were translatable from Norwegian. To shed more light over this matter, I will introduce to you our last speaker today, Johan Strang from SENS, Center of Nordic Studies. And he has titled his speech, and now I will go on to Danish, Hjælp, forstår hinanden, ikke, the English language and the Nordic community. So, welcome, Johan. The floor is yours.
On the table, I put the cat on the table. Thank you, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about English as our Lingua Nordica. When planning and coordinating this seminar, Elizabeth noted that the seminar would start with an American telling people to not to lose their Scandinavian languages, and end with a Swedish-speaking Finn telling us all to relax and embrace English. And sure, I will try not to disappoint you. But I will talk about the Scandinavian linguistic community and Nordic cooperation and put forward some arguments in favor of English as a Lingua Nordica. But first, I have to withdraw a bit. My argument is not that the official Nordic cooperation within the Nordic Council and the Council of Ministers should move over to English. I am, for very many different reasons, still of the opportunity that it is best that it takes place in Scandinavian, and I welcome the strengthening of Finnish and Icelandic in that context. But I do want us to be a bit more relaxed about English. And secondly, and more importantly, I don't practice what I teach. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a very dedicated Scandinavian speaker, so there is a massive performative inconsistency in the way that I approach this issue. I like to talk my mother tongue with anyone from the Nordic countries, probably to the degree that I'm quite annoying. If someone responds to me in English, I just continue in my Finland Swedish, perhaps raising my voice a bit, like those old Swedish-speaking ladies at the Stockmann department store here in Helsinki. And I almost always get understood. It may be because Finland Swedish is very well pronounced and easy to understand, or then it's simply because my privileges as a white middle-aging man. I was not that well understood in Copenhagen as a 20-year-old student in the late 90s. I might return to that, but I wanted to start by ensuring you that I do think that the Scandinavian linguistic community is important, and that there is, and that is something that I practice in my daily life. But on a daily basis, these two important caveats that hopefully will reduce the amount of rotten tomatoes that will be thrown at me over the web. I'm now ready to give my arguments for a more relaxed attitude toward English. And I have three closely related arguments. The first is that the idea of the Nordic countries does not build on language alone. The second is that using English in Nordic cooperation is often more democratic and more inclusive. And my third argument is that we should stop thinking about this in terms of either English or Scandinavian. We can have both, and indeed they can be supportive of each other. So first up, the Nordic community does not build on language alone. I'm not an expert in language or in linguistics. I work at the Center for Nordic Studies, where we promote, facilitate, and engage in cross-disciplinary study of the Nordic countries. And we give courses on Nordic politics, history, and culture. And when I get new students from within or from outside the Nordic region, I usually ask them of their preconceptions of Norden. What makes the Nordic region? What makes Norden Nordic? And the answers usually revolve around notions of the welfare state, the combination of individualism and state intervention, the high living costs, the cold and the darkness, the blonde people and the Viking heritage, the closeness to nature, the peculiar combination of tolerance and nationalism, or the peculiar combination of happiness and suicide, the cross flags, Protestantism, Lutheranism, but also secularism and modernism and functionalistic architecture and what have you. All of these are fascinating points, but equally fascinating is that language almost never comes up as one of the defining features. This might be because we are in Finland and where a minority of people don't have a Scandinavian mother tongue, or then language is simply too self-evident. I don't know, but it seems at least clear for the students that there are a lot of things that the Nordic countries have in common beyond the Scandinavian language. And I also feel that sometimes in stressing the importance of the Scandinavian linguistic community, we narrow our definition of Norden a bit. It becomes too much a matter of genetics and family relations, kinship, Nordicness as something that you're born with. And herein lies both a risk that we start taking Norden and Nordic community for granted, but there is also the additional risk that Norden becomes an exclusive and nationalistic discourse. And this leads me to my second argument, that English as a lingua nordica can sometimes be a way of being more inclusive and democratic in the Nordic community. So, among the many languages spoken in our region, it is basically only Swedish, Danish, and the two Norwegian languages that are mutually comprehensible, in principle at least. This means that a considerable part of the Nordic citizens, over 20%, are unable to participate on equal grounds. So in stubbornly insisting on the Scandinavian language in our Nordic interaction, we run the risk of creating a division between proper Nordics and less proper Nordics. And if Finns and Icelanders can feel a bit excluded in a room where you're expected to talk Scandinavian, the same is certainly also true for the Greenlandic and for people from Greenland or the Sami people. And at this point we come into difficult questions regarding the colonialist connotations in our insistence on the mutually comprehensible Scandinavian language as a basis for our Nordicness. We also have significant minorities whose first language is Romani or Yiddish, and not to speak about the growing number of people who have ended up in the Nordic countries as immigrants or refugees. I think it's absolutely crucial for the future of Nordic cooperation that these people learn to know and learn to love the Nordic community. But it is very difficult to imagine this happening in the Scandinavian languages. For someone who has learned Danish, Norwegian, or Swedish as a third or fourth language, it's not very easy to understand another variant of this Scandinavian language. And for an immigrant in Finland, it's safe to say that Finnish constitutes something of a challenge in itself, and the Nordic community will remain a mystery if it's dependent on your knowledge in Swedish. That said, I think many of people who move to Finland from abroad regret that they start learning Finnish instead of Swedish. At least this is what I've heard from a couple of UK citizens who aimed at staying inside the European Union through a Finnish citizenship. What? Why didn't you tell me that I could learn Swedish instead? It is, however, not these minorities that we're concerned of when we talk about the declining Scandinavian linguistic community. I'm well aware of that. And it's not the Finns and Icelanders either. I think that the knowledge of Swedish in Finland and Danish in Iceland is usually better than we think. When people talk about a silent majority, it's usually a sign that they're delusional. But in this particular case, I think that the expression is quite apt. The majority of Finns know Swedish quite well, but they prefer not to speak it themselves. The real challenge, of course, for the Scandinavian linguistic community is that the Danes and the Swedes have an increasingly difficult time understanding each other. And this is, of course, where the effort should be put in. I've not read any good studies explaining why Sweden and Denmark are growing apart linguistically. One reason is, of course, that the basic degeneration and decline of the Danish language in itself. Studies indicate that they swallow one letter per decade. It starts in Copenhagen and then it advances through the rest of the country. Sometimes the development is so fast that movies produced in Copenhagen need to be subtitled when they're aired in Jutland. Well, the real reason for Sweden and Denmark growing apart is probably that they're not very interested in following each other's cultures and debates, and a lot of the reasons are probably already said by Elizabeth in her talk earlier today. The Nordic community is not a central part of the political debates. Instead, they tend to focus on the US and other places for both political debates and cultural entertainment. They've grown apart mentally, and they grow apart also linguistically. To get the Swedes and the Danes talking to each other again is the main challenge for the Scandinavian linguistic community. In fact, in the Nordic Council, the Finns and the Icelanders are today in the fortunate position that they can use headphones when they don't understand spoken Scandinavian in the official Nordic cooperation, because there's always a translation going on. But I think that they've also started with a translation in English as well because of foreign guests. But there's always this social pressure of not putting on the headphones, which the Finns and the Icelanders avoid. The most ardent supporters of the Scandinavian linguistic community are found among the Norwegians and the Swedish-speaking Finns. And we are also the luckiest ones in the Nordic family, as the Norwegians tend to understand every Scandinavian language, while the Swedish-speaking Finn tend to be understood by everyone in the Nordic region. So I guess that the solution for the Scandinavian linguistic community would be that we'd all have the mouths of the Finland Swedes or the ears of the Norwegian. A major reason why the Norwegians understand Swedish and Danish so well is probably because of their great tolerance of dialects. I've heard this a number of times. And in terms of language, I always feel more comfortable in Oslo than in Stockholm, because no one comments on my dialect in Oslo, asking where I'm from and where I learned my Swedish or my Scandinavian. Or they don't switch into English because they think my Swedish is poor. Norway is a great place for linguistic tolerance, but at the same time it is, as Max Engman, the late professor in history, used to say, the only country in the world which has created a language struggle out of one language. Many Norwegians feel very passionately about their language and their dialects, and I wonder whether this is also reflected in their ardent attitude towards the Scandinavian linguistic community. And something similar, I think, can be said about us Swedish-speaking Finns. We love the Scandinavian linguistic community because it provides us with a political argument in defense of the status of Swedish in Finland. And while the basic argument is sound, I think, we usually approach the issue in a very short-sighted way if we insist that Nordic cooperation should take place only in Scandinavia, thereby practically kind of colonizing Nordic cooperation within Finland for ourselves. And this is detrimental to the state of Nordic cooperation in Finland, and it's detrimental to the state of the Swedish language in Finland as well in the long run. It is not a good idea that the Nordic connections in a private company, at an official department, or a ministry, or indeed in the government, is delegated to a semi-incompetent Swedish-speaking intern, rather than to someone who actually knows the issue, but perhaps whose Swedish is rudimentary or who gets frustrated when hearing Danish. If Sweden-speaking Finns colonize Nordic cooperation, it is also relegated into a second-order issue on a national level. And the more central Nordic cooperation is for the Finnish-speaking majority, the stronger the position of the Swedish language in Finland as well. So therefore, if we're interested in the future of the Swedish language in Finland, we should stand up for the Finnish minority in Nordic cooperation and be more relaxed about whether it takes place in English or not. So, finally, my argument about not thinking about this as a matter of a choice between English and Scandinavian. A couple of weeks ago, I was in this very same room, probably at the same place, as a moderator for a seminar that discussed the state of the Nordic or the Scandinavian language community on the basis of a report conducted by the Nordic Council of Ministers. They've asked over 2,000 people, young people in the ages 16 to 25 from across the region, about their skills and attitudes towards the other Nordic languages. The message from the seminar was very much that if we frame the future of the Scandinavian linguistic community as dependent on us defeating English, defeating the advance of English, we are setting us up for a battle that we cannot win, and a battle that we have already lost. English is already the primary language for much of what we do in our working lives, and particularly what the young people do in their daily lives. The report is very interesting as such, and available at the official pages of Nordic Cooperation. In the publication section, and it confirms much of what we know about the Scandinavian linguistic community, that the Norwegians are more at ease with using Scandinavian and so forth. But particularly interesting was that the report indicated very strongly that English and Scandinavian were used for different purposes and in different contexts. So English is usually used in official meetings when you feel it's necessary that you're understood correctly. But as soon as you move over to the coffee breaks, when you socialize and get to know each other, you gradually move over to Scandinavian. So stubbornly insisting on us talking Scandinavian at every Nordic meeting tends to exclude people. Indeed, my experience from the academic world has taught me that the best way of starting up a fruitful Nordic network is to first have a seminar in which you invite a couple of Germans and a couple of Brits. They don't know it, and hopefully they never realize it, but they're used as an excuse for us to talk English. This means that the Finns will accept the invitation, and it allows us to get to know each other on an equal ground. And gradually, we move over to Scandinavian in our informal discussions, and perhaps in due time we will be comfortable in having the whole meeting in Scandinavian as well. So the most important challenge for the Scandinavian linguistic community, I claim, is not to defeat the infiltration of the English language, but to make Nordic cooperation useful, interesting, and rewarding for as many people as possible. If we have a well-functioning Nordic cooperation, even if it takes place in English, it serves the Scandinavian linguistic community as well. An example of this is the Finnish Defense Ministry, which is repeatedly praised for being the outstanding department when it comes to the competences in Swedish language among the Finnish ministries. This despite the fact that Nordic defense cooperation, and indeed the bilateral defense cooperation with Sweden, takes place in English. And reports have also indicated that many that even if many trans-Nordic companies choose English as their official language, the Scandinavian languages tend to thrive within the company in itself, particularly the higher up you get in the management hierarchies. So I think that it's crucial that we stop looking at the choice between English and Scandinavian as a matter of either or, because the more we interact with each other in any language, the better it will be also for our Scandinavian linguistic community. So this was my provocation. Nordicness is not defined by language alone. English is more democratic and inclusive, and it's not a matter of either English or Scandinavian. So against this background, I think that we could be more relaxed about using English in Nordic meetings, even if I still think it's important that the Nordic Council and the Nordic Council of Ministers stick to Scandinavian, and that we shouldn't rob the Finns and Icelanders for their blessed opportunity of learning Scandinavian in school. So, thank you.
Also an interesting talk on, it brought back memories actually when I was in Tammisaari about 25 years ago, and I was looking for a place to stay, and I went to the shop, and I did my grocery shopping and like that, and at the same time I asked in Finnish that could you tell me how to get to, I can't remember the place now, but can you tell me how to get to this hotel or bread and breakfast? And so the person, even though I was speaking in Finnish, the person answered me in Swedish, and I speak absolutely no Swedish whatsoever. And I remember, oh dear, what am I going to do now? And then I thought, well, if I speak Finnish, then I'm not going to get an answer. And if I don't know Swedish, so, well, I'll just have to do it in English. And then I said, well, but the thing was, is that I had to go through saying that, I'm sorry, I wasn't born in Finland, and I've never learned Swedish, and I'd really like to speak Swedish with you, but it's either English or Finnish. And so it was just a funny situation that I found that like the importance of speaking, your own language and what it is. It just came to mind when you started in the beginning how adamant you are about speaking your own language with others and like that. And so yeah, but we do have a couple of questions for you. The first one is let's see, about by Ian, and I'm not going to get his name right. Ian, our chairperson. He says the growing number of people who have ended up in the Nordic countries as immigrants or refugees. Wait a minute. He says, first of all, is it possible for many of us or them to learn a local language? Secondly, far from all immigrants to Nordic countries speak English. To come from somewhere else is not a guarantee of speaking English. Does overemphasizing English not risk excluding immigrants who might be better served by encouraging them to learn the local language?
Yeah, that's a fair point. It might be that I took the knowledge of English for granted when it came to people from abroad, but I think that the basic point still is still true, that learning a Scandinavian language as someone who has come from abroad does not automatically make you proficient in the other Scandinavian languages. The boundaries are larger for them, so in that sense, my argument was that English could be a kind of a bridge, but I certainly see the point that we should not take proficiency in English for granted either when it comes to people coming here.
Yeah. Okay. And our other question, I just to check here. All right. Is by Christian Evans. He says many Finnish companies nowadays have English as the company language. However, there are many stories about foreigners applying for jobs and being told that they need to speak fluent Finnish. What do you think about this?
I think that one of a huge problem for the job market in particularly Finland, but throughout the Scandinavian countries is that we're too adamant on people knowing our language. I definitely think that we could be more liberal in that and include people who don't know or find a way. I think it's a political problem also. We need to find a way of getting people to the job market, even if their knowledge of the main language in the country is not that good. And English can be a way of that, of doing that. But it's actually a nice paradox an interesting paradox that English-speaking companies refuse to hire people who don't know Finnish or Swedish. That's a kind of anomaly that is quite funny, or not fun. Yeah, well, it's funny, but it's also depressing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Believe we have another question here by Kadavares, I believe. To take Johan's provocation a step further, you say talking English in a Nordic context puts everyone on equal grounds. Is it the case, though, with Finnish not being an Indo-European language? Shouldn't you all learn a language from a completely different language family, let's say Chinese or so, to be all democratic?
Yeah, well, that would be probably democratic in the way of kind of everyone has the same kind of starting point, but it's certainly not democratic in the way of inclusion because there's very few people who know Chinese in this context. It's true that perhaps, and we heard that from the last speaker as well that at least that in some cases you could say that the Finns are in an unequal position when it comes to learning English. But I still think that when it comes to the if you ask them whether they would what language or how they view the issue, I think that there is a massive vote in favor of English in some cases. But as I said, also I think that the proficiency in Swedish in Finland is much better than we perhaps think on the face of it. I mean, people tend to understand Swedish better than we think, but they don't like to talk it, to speak it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Just checking for more questions. Yes. Catherine Ranniko is asking, do you think younger people are more willing to use English as a lingua nordica?
That they're more likely than older people, like, yeah. Well, yes, I do think so. and the study that I referred to certainly indicates that among young people the inclination to use Scandinavian is certainly at a high level. But as I said, even among young people, I mean, young people they do everything in English in their daily lives, especially now when they're online all the time, when they're forced to be at home and distance teaching and these kinds of things. But even in this study that I'm referring to, it indicates that they use English as a way of getting to know each other, as the icebreaker, so to speak, and then gradually they move over to Scandinavian once they feel comfortable, they know each other, or they want to know each other more closely. So actually, I don't think that we should be too afraid of there being a huge gap between younger people, that younger people always talk English and the older people talk Scandinavian. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that young people also find Scandinavian eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, right, thank you. Right, these were all extremely interesting talks, and thank you, Johan, for this last talk. And I think, is it Hendrik or Ian who is going to? Mm-hmm.
Henrik's being very quiet, so no, I'll take that as a no. But yeah, I can say a few words.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, tack. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our three speakers. These were really very interesting topics. The thought only struck me now, and it didn't even strike me at all the whole time we were planning this event over the past 6 months, that we have three languages represented in the native languages of the speakers, which I think was a nice spread to have. I'm really impressed by the depth of knowledge and experience that our speakers had and how willing they were to share it with us and with an audience. I'm also very happy by the large numbers of people who have tuned in to watch us on this admittedly very sunny Wednesday afternoon when they could be outside enjoying the fresh air, but instead true language nerds, they're sitting in listening to these speakers talking about 3 linguistic topics. I enjoyed all the presentations. I hope you all did as well. I'm going to plug Neat because that's kind of goes with the job. If you're interested in joining Nordic Editors and Translators and becoming part of this community, this growing community of language professionals in Nordic countries, and not only in the Nordic countries, you can go to nordicedit.fi and then click join at the top of the homepage. And for just 30 euros a year, you will have access to member events and training sessions and an internal mailing list and a wonderful community of fellow language professionals. We are going to move over to the Zoom session in a few minutes, or I suppose whenever we're ready to go. But first, I will just say again, thanks to Nordic Culture Point for the great cooperation. Thanks to Henrik Marstrander for setting up the technical side of this broadcast, which is very high tech. I can't get my head around it. I'm just sitting in my office at home, just speaking to you. But he has set it up, and I think it's all worked rather well. So if you want to join the Zoom session, you can go to nordicedit.fi and then click on events, and then there will be a link at the top of that events page saying the English as a Lingua Nordica seminar. You click on that link, and then there will be a link there to join the after session Zoom meeting. And NEED members will already have received this email, this link in their email. But for those of you who aren't able to join that session. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I'm glad you could make it. I hope you found it useful. If you have any feedback or suggestions about future NEET sessions or topics for future NEET events, you can email info@nordicedit.fi. Thanks to Judi, our member in Turku, for taking those questions and passing them on to the speakers and for introducing the speakers. And yeah, have a lovely Wednesday evening, and I'll see some of you in the Zoom meetup on another platform. Thanks and good evening.